You can tell a sniper's experience by how he reads the wind, the old man said quietly. But once in a while, the wind reads him back. The statement drifted across the firing range and vanished beneath the crackling frustration of a failed training day. Nobody paid attention to it. Nobody except one young Marine who happened to glance over his shoulder. The Marine Corps long-range evaluation at Camp Pendleton had already fallen apart. 12 Marine snipers stood behind their rifles under the hot Southern California sun, their confidence wearing thinner with every missed shot. More than 2,000 yards away, a steel target sat on a distant hillside, barely visible through heat shimmer rising from the dry terrain. Every shooter on the line had missed. Some by inches, some by yards. The latest miss drew a frustrated curse from Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce as he lowered his spotting scope and rubbed a hand across his jaw. Around him, officers and evaluators sat beneath temporary shade canopies, watching the embarrassing performance unfold. This was supposed to be a showcase. Instead, it was becoming a lesson in failure. Expensive ballistic computers sat mounted beside rifles. Wind meters flashed numbers. Tablets displayed calculations. Everything said the shooters should have been hitting. Yet the steel remained silent. Logan looked downrange again and felt his patience slipping away. "Run it again," he barked. Another sniper settled behind his rifle. Another calculation. Another trigger press. Several seconds later, a puff of dust appeared well wide of the target. A groan spread across the firing line. Logan removed his sunglasses and stared at the distant hillside, as if determination alone might solve the problem. The target seemed almost mocking now. Beyond the spectators, and behind a maintenance fence, stood an elderly man holding a push broom. He wore faded work pants, a sun-bleached green jacket, and a worn baseball cap. His white hair peeked out beneath the brim. He looked like the kind of employee people passed every day without noticing. While everyone else focused on computers and scopes, the old man watched the grass. He watched the dust. He watched the shimmer floating above the rocks. His pale blue eyes moved slowly across the valley as though reading a language nobody else could see. Logan noticed him standing there and frowned. The range crew usually stayed clear during evaluations. The old man remained silent for another moment before speaking. "You're looking at the wrong wind." Several Marines turned. A few exchanged amused looks. Logan stared at him. "Excuse me." The old man rested both hands on the broom handle. "The flag near the target isn't the problem." A chuckle escaped one of the younger snipers. Another Marine smirked. Logan folded his arms. "We've got spotters, weather data, and real-time measurements." The old man nodded politely. "I know." The response somehow irritated Logan even more. "Then you know we're handling it." The old man simply looked back toward the distant hillside. Heat waves danced above the ground. Dust swirled through a shallow ravine halfway between the firing line and the target. Far above, a hawk drifted lazily on an invisible current. "No," he said softly. "You're fighting 3 winds and only measuring 1. Several Marines laughed outright this time. One pulled out his phone and began recording. The old man didn't react. He kept watching the valley, watching the terrain, watching the invisible forces moving through it. As another failed shot echoed across the range, nobody realized they were standing a few yards away from the only person there who already knew exactly why every sniper on the line was missing. The laughter lingered for several seconds after the old man finished speaking. It was not cruel laughter at first. It was the kind that came from confidence, from people who believed they already knew the answer. The young Marine holding his phone zoomed in on the maintenance worker standing behind the fence. 3 wins, he repeated with a grin. That is a new one. Several others chuckled. Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce did not laugh. His frustration had already burned through amusement. Every miss on the range felt like another weight pressing down on his shoulders. The evaluation team had arrived from headquarters before sunrise. Senior officers were watching. Reports would be written. Questions would be asked. And right now, his sniper platoon looked completely unprepared. Another shooter stepped onto the firing line. Another set of calculations flashed across a screen. Wind speed, humidity, temperature, elevation. Everything was entered correctly. Everything looked perfect. The shot broke cleanly. Several seconds passed. A dust cloud appeared below the target. Another miss. Logan shut his eyes for a moment. The steel plate remained silent. The old man slowly shook his head. Too much correction. Logan turned immediately. What was that? The old man rested against the broom handle. You adjusted for the wind at the target. His voice remained calm. But the strongest push is happening 800 yards short of it. A young staff sergeant snorted. And how exactly would you know that? The old man pointed toward a distant rock formation baking beneath the afternoon sun. Heat. Nobody answered. The rocks are pulling air upward. The ravine beside them is pulling air down. They cancel each other until about 1,200 yards. After that, the current shifts. Several Marines exchanged confused looks. The explanation sounded strange. Yet something about the way he said it felt certain. Not guessed. Not imagined. Certain. Logan folded his arms tighter. You some kind of meteorologist? The old man smiled faintly. No, then what are you? The question hung in the dry air. The old man looked downrange again before answering. Just a groundskeeper. More laughter followed. Logan looked away, dismissing him completely. Across the range, the evaluation officials continued making notes. Tom was slipping away. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier there had been confidence. Now there was pressure. Every Marine on the line could feel it. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks watched the old man carefully. Unlike the others, he had stopped laughing. Something about the stranger felt familiar. Not his face. Not his clothes. Something else. A feeling. Ethan had grown up around veterans. His grandfather had served for decades. He remembered the quiet men who gathered at family barbecues. Men who rarely talked about themselves. Men who spoke softly because they never needed to prove anything. The old man standing behind the fence reminded him of them. Another failed shot echoed across the valley. Logan cursed under his breath. The old man glanced toward the firing line. You are chasing numbers. Logan spun around. What does that mean? The old man pointed toward the distant hillside. The computers are measuring conditions. The bullet does not fly through conditions. He paused. It flies through air. For the first time, nobody laughed. The words settled across the range like dust. Ethan looked toward the target, then toward the old man, then back again. A strange feeling tightened in his chest. He could not explain it. He only knew one thing. The man holding that broom was watching the same problem as everyone else. Yet somehow, he seemed to be seeing an entirely different range. The afternoon heat continued to build across the valley. Waves of shimmering air drifted above the sun-baked earth, turning distant objects into blurred silhouettes. The target looked less like a piece of steel and more like a mirage floating above the hillside. Another sniper settled behind his rifle. The firing line had grown quieter now. The earlier jokes had faded. Confidence was being replaced by determination, and determination was slowly becoming frustration. The shooter checked his data one final time. Wind speed, temperature, atmospheric pressure. Every number matched the recommendation on his screen. He squeezed the trigger. The sound rolled across the range. Everyone watched. Several long seconds passed. A puff of dust appeared beyond the target. Mississippi. A heavy silence followed. Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce lowered his binoculars and stared toward the hillside. His jaw tightened. He knew these Marines. They were disciplined, skilled, reliable. This was not supposed to happen. Yet the target remained untouched. Across the range, officers seated beneath the shade canopy exchanged quiet remarks. A clipboard changed hands. One captain checked his watch. The evaluation schedule was slipping behind. Every failed shot made the atmosphere heavier. The old groundskeeper remained where he was. His broom leaned against the fence beside him. He had not moved in nearly 10 minutes. Ethan Brooks noticed that while everyone else kept looking at equipment, the old man kept studying the terrain itself. His eyes moved from patches of dry grass to distant rocks, then toward a narrow draw cutting through the valley floor. It was as if he were following invisible pathways through the air. Ethan found himself watching the same landscape. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed a small dust devil forming briefly near the rocks before vanishing. A moment later, grass farther downrange bent in a completely different direction. The old man had been right. The wind was not behaving consistently. It was changing from place to place. Logan called for another shooter. This time the Marine adjusted based on observations from multiple spotters positioned along the range. The correction looked reasonable. The shot looked perfect. It missed again. A low groan swept through the firing line. Logan removed his cap and wiped sweat from his forehead. He was running out of explanations. The old man glanced toward the target and quietly shook his head. Ethan finally stepped closer to the fence. You knew that one would miss? He asked. The old man looked at him. His pale blue eyes seemed calm despite the tension surrounding them. The bullet never had a chance. Ethan frowned. How can you tell? The old man pointed toward the valley. Because the air changed after he measured it. Ethan followed his gaze. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Yet nothing else was working. Nearby, one of the Marines who had been recording earlier laughed nervously. What is next? Are you going to tell us the hills are talking too? The old man smiled faintly. They are. More laughter followed, but it sounded weaker now. Less certain. Ethan noticed something else. The old man was not trying to impress anyone. He was not seeking attention. He never raised his voice. Never argued. Never defended himself. He simply watched. As though he had seen this problem before. As though somewhere in a distant chapter of his life, on another range under another sky, the same invisible winds had already taught him lessons nobody else here had learned. The next miss seemed to drain whatever patience remained on the range. Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce lowered his binoculars and stared at the distant target as though sheer determination could force steel to ring. It did not. Around him, conversations had grown quieter. Nobody was joking anymore. The evaluators continued writing notes beneath the shade canopy, and the weight of those notes seemed heavier than the California heat. The old groundskeeper watched the valley for another moment before slowly reaching down beside the fence. Ethan Brooks noticed the movement immediately. Resting against the chain link was a long canvas case faded by decades of sun and use. Ethan had not even realized it was there. The old man lifted it carefully, almost respectfully. Several Marines turned toward him. One of them laughed when he saw the worn fabric. What is that supposed to be? The old man did not answer. He laid the case across a nearby maintenance table and unfastened the brass clasps one by one. The sounds were soft but strangely distinct in the growing silence. Logan glanced over with obvious annoyance. What are you doing? Still the old man said nothing. He folded the canvas back. Inside rested a rifle unlike any on the firing line. There were no carbon fiber components. No advanced optics. No digital attachments. Just walnut wood darkened by age and steel polished by decades of careful hands. It looked less like equipment and more like history. Several younger Marines exchanged amused looks. One shook his head. You have got to be kidding. Another laughed outright. That belongs in a museum. The old man gently lifted the rifle from the case. His movements were slow, but there was nothing uncertain about them. The weapon settled naturally into his hands. Logan walked closer and folded his arms. That thing is older than half the buildings on this base. A few Marines chuckled. Ethan remained silent. Something about the rifle felt familiar. The stock carried small scars earned over a very long life. Near the receiver was a deep gouge running diagonally across the wood. One of the younger snipers stepped forward and pointed at it. What happened there? He asked. Drop it. More laughter followed. The old man lowered his eyes toward the mark. For the first time all afternoon, his expression changed. Only slightly. Only for a moment. But Ethan saw it. The humor vanished from the old man's face. His thumb moved slowly across the worn groove. The range seemed to fade around him. The wind still carried dust through the valley. Heat still shimmered above the rocks. Yet his attention had drifted somewhere far away. Somewhere nobody else could see. Logan noticed the change too. What is so special about that scratch? The old man remained quiet. His thumb traced the gouge again. The wood had been polished smooth by years of contact. Whatever story lived inside, that mark had clearly been carried for a very long time. A hawk circled high above the range. The dry grass shifted in the afternoon breeze. Ethan looked from the rifle to the old man and felt the same strange certainty growing stronger. The groundskeeper standing beside the fence was not simply an employee who happened to know something about the wind. The rifle in his hands suggested something else entirely. Something older. Something hidden. And for the first time that day, Ethan found himself wondering who Dean Walker had really been before anyone on this base knew his name. Dean Walker's thumb remained on the worn gouge in the walnut stock. The laughter around him faded into the background. The dry California wind disappeared. The bright afternoon sun vanished. For a brief moment, he was no longer standing beside a Marine Corps firing range. He was 19 years old again beneath a gray sky half a century earlier. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Low clouds drifted through distant ridgelines. Everything was damp. Everything was quiet. Dean lay motionless on a hillside overlooking a narrow valley. The rifle in his hands was the same one resting against his shoulder today. Back then the wood had been smooth and new. The metal still carried the sharp finish of fresh-issue equipment. Around him, other young Marines watched the valley through binoculars. Nobody spoke unless necessary. Hours passed that way, watching, waiting, learning patience from the landscape itself. Dean remembered the lesson an older instructor had taught him during those long days. Most shooters watch the target, the instructor had said. The best ones watch everything between themselves and the target. At the time, Dean had not fully understood. Then the wind changed. Grass bent one direction near the ridge. Tree branches moved another direction farther below. Mist drifted across the valley floor in a third direction entirely. The terrain created invisible rivers in the air. That day Dean learned the truth. Distance was not the challenge. Understanding was. The memory shifted. A sudden gust swept across the hillside. A loose section of equipment struck the rifle stock before tumbling away. The impact carved a deep mark into the wood. Dean remembered staring at it afterward. At first it looked like damage. Later it became a reminder. Every time he saw that scar, he remembered the lesson hidden inside it. The land always spoke. The wind always revealed itself. The problem was that most people never slowed down enough to listen. The memory gradually dissolved. The gray hillside disappeared. The pine trees faded. The distant clouds vanished. Dean found himself back at Camp Pendleton beneath the California sun. The rifle remained steady in his hands. Around him, Marines continued studying the old weapon. Ethan Brooks could not take his eyes off the gouge in the stock. There was something deeply personal in the way Dean had touched it. Not pride, not nostalgia, respect. Logan Pierce finally broke the silence. You carried that thing a long time? Dean looked down at the rifle. Long enough. And you still trust it? Logan asked. Dean's faint smile returned. I trust what it taught me. Logan shook his head. To him the answer sounded like another old man's riddle. Yet Ethan noticed something else. Dean never bragged. Never claimed special achievements. Never hinted at medals or records. He spoke about the rifle the way someone might speak about an old teacher. The afternoon breeze moved through the range once more. Dust swirled across the valley floor. The distant target shimmered in the heat. Dean lifted his eyes toward the hillside and watched the invisible currents dancing across the terrain. After a moment, he quietly said, "The wind is changing again." This time nobody laughed. The reaction was subtle, but Ethan Brooks saw it immediately. Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody made another joke about old rifles or invisible winds. The range had reached a point where confidence was no longer protecting anyone from doubt. Every missed shot had chipped away at certainty. Every failed calculation had raised a question nobody wanted to ask. What if the old groundskeeper was right? Ethan looked down at the rifle resting in Dean Walker's hands. The walnut stock, the worn metal, the deep gouge polished smooth by decades of use. Something tugged at the back of his memory. He had seen that shape before. Not the rifle itself. A marking, a symbol, a detail. He just could not place it. As another Marine prepared for a shot, Ethan quietly stepped away from the group. Nobody noticed. Everyone's attention remained fixed on the firing line and the target sitting 2,000 yards away beneath the dancing heat waves. Ethan walked toward the equipment shed near the edge of the range where a small workstation sat connected to the base network. He pulled out his phone and opened a search portal used for historical training materials. At first, he searched for old Marine sniper programs. Nothing. Then he searched for legacy sniper instructors. Hundreds of names appeared. Still nothing. Frustrated, he closed his eyes and pictured the rifle again. The gouge. The stock. The small engraving near the receiver. Suddenly he remembered. Earlier, when Dean had lifted the rifle from the canvas case, Ethan had caught a brief glimpse of a faded insignia burned into the wood. It had looked familiar. He typed a new search. The results appeared almost instantly. Ethan stared at the screen. His heartbeat quickened. The insignia belonged to an early Marine Corps sniper development unit that had existed decades earlier. A unit so small that most modern Marines had never heard of it. Ethan scrolled farther. A training article appeared. Then a photograph. The image was grainy and old. Several Marines stood beside a range under a bright sky. One young man held a rifle remarkably similar to Dean's. Ethan leaned closer. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Before he could continue reading, a voice behind him spoke. "What exactly are you looking at?" Ethan turned quickly. The speaker was Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delaney, the senior armory chief assigned to the evaluation. Delaney had spent nearly 30 years around Marine weapons programs and training schools. Ethan hesitated before showing him the screen. Delaney glanced down casually. Then his expression changed. Completely. The color drained from his face. He took the phone from Ethan's hand and stared at the photograph for several long seconds. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Ethan pointed toward the range, toward the old man standing beside the fence. Delaney looked up. His eyes found Dean Walker instantly. The armory chief did not speak. He simply kept staring. The silence lasted so long that Ethan began to feel uneasy. Finally, Delaney handed the phone back. "Stay here," he said. "Do not say anything to anyone." Then he turned and walked rapidly toward the operations building. For the first time all afternoon, somebody on that base looked genuinely alarmed. And Ethan suddenly realized the story behind Dean Walker was far bigger than a rifle, a firing range, or a difficult shot. The atmosphere across the range changed without anyone understanding why. The missed shots still echoed through the valley. The evaluators still sat beneath their canopies. The distant steel target still stood untouched on the hillside. Yet something unseen had begun moving behind the scenes. Inside the operations building, Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delaney moved faster than anyone had seen him move all day. He stepped through secured doors, bypassed casual conversations, and headed directly toward a communications office normally reserved for senior personnel. The photograph Ethan had shown him remained fixed in his mind. The old insignia, the rifle, the face. Delaney had spent decades studying Marine Corps history, weapons programs, and legendary instructors whose names rarely appeared in public records. Some stories survived only in training circles. Some names existed only in archived documents. Dean Walker was one of those names. Delaney reached a secure terminal and entered a personnel query. The system processed the request. Then several restricted files appeared. Delaney stared at the screen in silence. Even after 30 years in uniform, he rarely felt surprise anymore. This was different. He immediately picked up a phone and made a call. Across the base, another officer answered. Delaney spoke quietly. The conversation lasted less than a minute. By the time it ended, a second call was already being placed. Then a third. Each person reacted the same way. Silence first. Questions second. Urgency third. Back on the range, nobody knew any of this was happening. Logan Pierce remained focused on the evaluation. Tom was slipping away. The schedule had become a problem. Headquarters representatives were checking watches. The final assessment window would close soon. Another Marine prepared to fire. Another careful calculation appeared on a screen. Another solution generated by software. Dean Walker stood beside the fence watching the terrain. He seemed completely unaware of the growing activity elsewhere on the base. Ethan glanced toward him repeatedly. The old man appeared calm, almost detached, as if none of this mattered. As if success or failure on the range was merely another afternoon beneath the sun. A warm gust swept across the valley. Dry grass bent toward the east. Seconds later it shifted back. The distant heat shimmer twisted above the rocks. Dean quietly watched every change. Ethan found himself doing the same. For the first time in his career, he was paying more attention to the landscape than the equipment. A helicopter could suddenly be heard somewhere far away. Its sound drifted faintly across the base before fading again. Most people ignored it. Ethan did not. Neither did Dean. The old man briefly lifted his eyes toward the horizon before returning his attention to the range. Logan called for another shooter. The Marine settled behind his rifle. The range fell silent. Everyone waited. Before the shot could be taken, a staff officer hurried across the gravel carrying a radio. His pace was unusually fast. He moved directly toward Logan and whispered something into his ear. Logan frowned immediately. "What do you mean they are coming here?" The officer repeated himself. Logan looked stunned. For what? The officer simply shook his head. He did not know. Neither did anyone else. Yet somewhere beyond the firing range, vehicles had already begun moving. Phones were ringing. Orders were being passed. And all because an old groundskeeper carrying a weathered rifle had quietly appeared beside a fence on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. The range fell into an uneasy silence. Nobody understood why senior personnel, were suddenly moving across the base. Nobody understood why radios were crackling with unusual traffic, yet the evaluation clock continued ticking. The target still stood untouched on the distant hillside, shimmering beneath the late afternoon heat. Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce looked toward the officers gathered under the canopy, then back toward the firing line. He had reached the point where pride mattered less than results. Another miss would accomplish nothing. Another calculation would only produce another excuse. His eyes drifted toward Dean Walker. The old groundskeeper stood exactly where he had been all afternoon, calm and patient, the old rifle resting comfortably in his hands. Logan hesitated for several seconds before speaking. "You think you can do better?" Every conversation stopped. The question seemed to freeze the air itself. Several Marines looked at one another. Others stared directly at Dean. The old man did not answer immediately. He simply looked toward the valley, the grass, the rocks, the shifting heat waves, the invisible currents moving through the terrain. Finally he spoke. "I think the valley already told us the answer." Logan exhaled sharply. "That is not what I asked." Dean's eyes remained fixed downrange. "I know." Another long silence followed. Then Logan stepped aside and pointed toward the firing position. "Show me." A few Marines exchanged surprised glances. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody made another joke about museums or old rifles. Curiosity had replaced arrogance. Dean walked slowly toward the firing line. His movements were steady and deliberate. He carried the rifle as naturally as another man might carry a favorite book. When he reached the shooting position, he did not immediately settle behind the weapon. Instead, he stood quietly for several moments. He studied the terrain. The breeze brushed against his jacket. Dust drifted across a distant ridge. A hawk circled high above the valley before banking slightly to the south. Dean watched all of it. Every detail, every subtle change. Logan frowned. "Do you need a spotter?" Dean shook his head. "No." "A weather reading?" "No." "Ballistic software?" Dean smiled faintly. "No." The answer unsettled everyone more than if he had requested all three. Slowly, he lowered himself into position. The old rifle rested against his shoulder. His gaze moved through the scope. Not rushing. Not forcing anything. Ethan Brooks watched closely. What struck him most was the complete absence of tension. Every Marine who had fired that day carried the pressure of expectations. Dean carried none of it. He looked less like a man attempting a difficult shot and more like a man listening to a familiar conversation. The valley seemed to grow quieter around him. Even the evaluators stopped speaking. Far beyond the range, the faint sound of approaching helicopters drifted across the sky. Few people noticed. Their attention remained fixed on the old man behind the rifle. Dean adjusted nothing, touched no electronic device, consulted no chart. He simply waited. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled, as though the wind had finally said exactly what he had been waiting to hear. For several seconds, nothing moved. Dean Walker remained perfectly still behind the old rifle. The valley stretched before him in waves of gold grass, distant stone, and shimmering air. Every Marine on the range watched. Every evaluator watched. Even Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce seemed to forget about schedules, reports, and assessments. The entire range had become silent. Dean's eyes remained focused downrange, not on the target itself, but on everything surrounding it. The terrain, the sunlight, the movement hidden between one point and another. Then, at last, he gently squeezed the trigger. The sound echoed across the valley and disappeared into the distance. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Several long seconds passed. Then a sharp metallic ring floated back across the hillside. Clear, distinct, unmistakable. The target had finally answered. A stunned silence settled over the range. One Marine lowered his binoculars. Another blinked twice as if he could not trust what he had seen. Ethan Brooks felt a chill run through him despite the afternoon heat. Logan Pierce stared at the distant steel target. The expression on his face was not disbelief. It was realization. Dean slowly lowered the rifle and stood. No celebration. No dramatic gesture. No smile of victory. He simply stepped back from the firing position as though he had finished an ordinary task. Before anyone could speak, the growing sound of rotor blades swept across the range. Heads turned toward the sky. A helicopter approached from the far side of the base and descended toward a nearby landing area. Dust swirled across the gravel. Several vehicles arrived almost simultaneously. Senior officers stepped out before the rotors had fully slowed. The range personnel exchanged confused looks. This was far beyond anything connected to a routine evaluation. The highest-ranking officer moved quickly across the range. Marines instinctively straightened. Conversations died immediately. Yet the officer ignored everyone. He did not stop at the evaluators. He did not stop at the command staff. He walked directly toward Dean Walker. The old groundskeeper remained standing beside the rifle case, calm, unmoved, as though none of this surprised him. The officer halted in front of him. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then the officer rendered a crisp salute. An audible gasp moved through the crowd. Logan Pierce froze. Ethan Brooks could hardly breathe. The officer lowered his hand and smiled. "It has been a long time, sir." Dean returned a small nod. "Yes, it has." The officer glanced toward the target on the distant hillside. The last recorded instructor to solve that range without instrumentation. Several Marines exchanged stunned looks. The officer continued. "The man who helped build the doctrine half of us still study." Nobody said a word. Dean looked down at the old rifle resting in its case. Sunlight reflected softly from the worn metal. The gouge in the walnut stock caught the light for just a moment. Then he closed the case and fastened the brass clasps. Around him stood Marines who had spent the afternoon measuring wind with instruments. Dean had measured it with patience. They had searched for answers in screens. He had found them in the landscape itself. As he turned to leave, Ethan heard him quietly say, "The wind never changes its mind. Only ours." Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. The range remained silent as Dean Walker walked away beneath the fading California sun, leaving behind a lesson no report would ever fully capture. Some skills fade with time. Others become part of who a person is. And some forms of respect arrive not with applause, but with silence.